architect, and I also happen to be president of the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative. I wasn't actually expecting that. This club is a magnificent example of the fruits we all enjoy when historic preservation is done extremely well. At Lesby, we're also looking to preserve examples of the tenement streetscapes in Manhattan's Lower East Side that historically have been central to the story of immigration in this country, going back 2 centuries and continuing to today. The area is also known for some great architecture. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to try to preserve it before it all disappears, as so much of Manhattan has been recently. Well, it's been over 40 years since I first set foot into the Salmagundi Club, starting my master's thesis in historic preservation on the building. When I first approached the club from the outside, I have to admit I thought it was impressive, but at that point it had been stripped of all of its exterior ornament. All of the facade ornament had been shaved back, so it didn't have quite the depth and beauty that it has today. But when I walked inside, that's where I was truly amazed. I felt like I was walking into a small jewel box, or not so small jewel box as the case may be, and felt like it was really something that I had never quite experienced before. So my work for the thesis consisted of spending untold hours poking around the club to figure out what was original to the building and what had been added later, as well as doing research on the building's owners, the Howleys, the Parks, the boarding house, and finally, of course, the Salmagundi Club. What I ended up with after all this research was kind of a giant tome with a massive amount of information, kind of in everything you always want to know about the Salmagundi Club building but were afraid to ask, which I kind of thought might be the last word on the place. Well, I was wrong. I've been thrilled to see that Anthony Bellov, who many of you know, and you'll be hearing from in just a few minutes, has used my thesis as a jumping off point. He's taken a deeper dive into investigating the physical building and doing much more extensive historical research using all the modern tools and techniques to come up with loads of new information that adds so much to the story of this unique and wonderful place. Sherlock Holmes would be proud. Anthony is a native Brooklynite, an Upper West Sider, award-winning videographer, classical pianist, tenor, singing teacher, public speaker, architectural historian, photographer, and preservationist. He has a bachelor's in architecture from Pratt Institute, a master's in museum leadership from Bank Street College, a longtime volunteer at the Merchants House Museum, a board member of the American Research Center in Egypt, and a member of the Salmagundi Club. I have to add that he's got an amazing enthusiasm, curiosity, and drive, as well as being a super fun person to be around. So please join me in welcoming Anthony Bellov.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was above and beyond. Your drink will be waiting for you. Before I get started, I just want to warn you all that I have been suffering from a horrendous cold, and I am now flying high on Fisherman's Friend, Monica Honey, lots of adrenaline, and if my voice gives out before the end of the night, we'll be doing interpretive dance. So I suspect that will be a first. But I do need to thank Richard, first and foremost, for that amazing thesis of his. Those of you who were here for part 1 knows that it weighs 5 pounds, because I weighed it. Bob Muller is also in the audience tonight. Bob is a longtime Salmagundian who, for many years, has been considered the historian of the club. And these are 2 people that I could not have done these talks without. I also want to thank Lynn Mandel, who is a friend of mine in my own hood, who is an avid genealogist, and I would mention somebody's name, and 2 hours later there would be an entire history of the person in my email, including passport photos, some of which you will see later on tonight, and another person who's absolutely essential. With that said, it is time to move on to part 3. You will recall in our previous episode, our Cape Crusaders were standing in front of the library at the landing of the 2nd floor trying to decide whether or not to go up or down. And, well, they decided to go down. But they can slide down the back poles. We have to walk down the staircase. And while we do, it's a great opportunity to review a couple of important points about the house. First and foremost, this house is built in the Italian style of architecture. It is a 4-bay mansion. If you count the windows, you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4. With that, and the brownstone front, and the height of the building, and all the amenities inside the building, it constitutes for an official mansion. Wow. Built in 1853, as you probably all know by now. It's important to remember this house was purpose-built, not spec-built. So the Hawleys, who we'll discuss briefly in a few moments, got to pick and choose all the special finishes and arrangements. But not so much the actual plan, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But in 1853, Italian architecture was the end-all. So let's review a little bit of the timeline, because it's a little complicated and it's important for our understanding of how this building wound up looking the way it does. In 1853, Ira Hawley bought the 2 empty lots that comprise this property. He paid, if I remember correctly, $18,000 for them, which is roughly $684,000 in today's money. It was a lot of money in 1853, but I don't think you could get this house for $683,000. Ira died in 1865, and Sarah and the family remained here until she passed in 1892. And in 1893, the family sold the property to William Gray Park and his wife Elizabeth and family. And here are those passport photos that I was talking about. One of the interesting things about this house is that it keeps accruing in wealth. The families just get wealthier and wealthier. The Hawleys obviously were doing very, very well financially. The Parks put the Hawleys to shame. And then they also carried out a few minimal changes to the building, some updates. It's important for you to understand the room you're sitting in right now is not part of the original building. We're technically camping out in the backyard right now. But on the other side of this archway here was the family dining room. And it was easy for Salmagundi to open this space up because this opening here has ceased being a brick wall and had become a wonderful wall of windows, which William here was responsible for doing. And they also introduced some electricity and added bathrooms to the structure. In 1905, they rented the property out to Winthrop Astor Chandler and his wife Margaret and family. Loads of money. These people were really party people, and they only rented the house for a year. But at some point in their peregrinations around the whole planet, Winthrop managed to sit for a portrait from Augustus St. Gaudius. So he had a little bit of time on his hands. Then, for almost 4 years, the Kelly family, Thomas and Emerance, rented the house. And if anything, they were even richer than the previous family. Thomas was a very, very well-known Catholic Irish family. His father made a fortune on Wall Street, and they really had more money than they knew what to do. So they spent some of it building the Lady Chapel behind St. Patrick's Cathedral. He paid for it out of his own pocket. They were friends to 2 popes. They were named a prince and princess of the Holy Roman Empire. And they had a lot of fun here in the building. In my last talk, I talked about the art collection and some important pieces that were hanging here, even then, prior to Salmagundi. But in 1909, William Park passed on, and the estate decided it was time to update the house. He leased it out to the Dunscombe Company, which specialized in making boarding houses. And at that point, a lot of changes were carried out in the building, some of which we still see today, especially upstairs. The architect was Charles M. Sutton. That's one of the drawings of the house right down there. And he was, to put it politely, just a minor architect. He specialized in adding bathrooms to brownstones and that sort of thing. Not like the architect we talked about last time, who did the renovations for Salmagundi. If you don't know who I'm referring to, it's on YouTube, folks. But in 1915, the lease for the Dunscombe was picked up by Sidney Colstock, a very interesting character. I wish I could learn more about her. She was a feminist, she was a bit of an anarchist, a bit of a socialist. She knew all the counterculture people, all the anti-people, and this building was filled with just that type of Greenwich Village bohemian that we hear all the stories about. It must have been a lot of fun here, but I've not been able to, Lynn Mandel has not been able to find a photograph of her, and she just turns up in mentions of other people's memoirs. But she knew everybody, and she has a story to tell. I wish I could find that story. But 2 years of running the old Chelsea, as she called it, with a restaurant and a public venue, and a bunch of bohemians running in and out the front door, and the Fifth Avenue Association was up in arms. And ultimately, they sued the owners, the Park Estate, and they basically said, out. And so she got booted up to 16th or 17th Street, where she opened Old Chelsea 2, and this property was sold to Salmagundi. It was founded in 1871, New York's oldest art and artist club, and one of the oldest in the nation, and they've been here ever since, folks. They also carried out some massive changes in the building, and that's really what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to be visiting floors where the traces of 1853 sometimes are minimal. Now, we're coming down that staircase, and today, in 2023, there's a different configuration from the main floor down to the basement level, which is where we're headed. This is the way it looks today. So it's a U now, but originally like an L. And so they just made it easier to get up and down for the basement, because in past times it seems unlikely that the basement was really used, certainly not for entertaining. And I first became suspicious of this when I just listened to how creaky those stairs are. And I said, this is not original. This is just not original. And I consulted some of the existing blueprints. And sure enough, I was right. When you get to the bottom of that landing, this is what's waiting for you. Now, one of the things worth mentioning is that the basement is the most altered level in the entire building. When the Hawleys, or the Parks, or the Chandlers, or the Kellys walk down that L-shaped flight of stairs, this is not what they saw. They saw basic wall and basic doors. Not open like this, not archways. It was just a very different experience. And one thing that's worth mentioning is that the building itself had eclectic interiors. There was a Greek Revival interior, which we'll talk about. There was a Gothic Revival or Elizabethan interior, which was the former dining room, located here. And then, of course, the Italianate interiors. And then some interiors that are just old, without anything really specific to give them a stylistic name. So for those of you who are not familiar with the landing, and those of you out there in live stream land and in YouTube land in years to come, when you land at the bottom of the stairs and you look towards your left, you'll be looking east towards the rear of the building, and if you look to the right, you'll be looking towards Fifth Avenue, towards the front of the building. So this is what you see if you ever come and visit the building. Now let's talk about the plan, because this will help you to sort of, orient yourself. This is the plan today. The green is outdoors. I'm not going to call it old garden, but it's outdoors. The tan color in the back is the room underneath where we're sitting now. So you can see a huge extension filled in pretty much the entire backyard. The building is 5 stories: cellar, basement, main floor, second and third floor family spaces, plus the 4th floor staff quarters. And I calculated somewhere around 11,000 square feet, folks. And as I keep making the point, the details and finishes were determined by the builder. In this case, the Hawleys, because they were having the house built for themselves. So the specific look of certain spaces they chose. Now let's go back to 1910, and let me thank Richard copiously for making photocopies of those plans, because the buildings department has lost the 1910 plans. And so although these are only scans of a photocopy, they're all we have at the moment. I expect any day, yay, hooray for that! They'll turn up somewhere. But as of today, we have the 1910 plans only in Richard's photocopies. But the first room we're going to visit tonight is this small green room, which is facing Fifth Avenue. And just to orient you, this is the lower entrance, what we call the servants' entrance today. And there's a couple of mysteries in 1910. There's a little sink right in the corner of what's now our building manager Dan Greenwald's desk. And if you walk down the staircase and listen really carefully, maybe you can hear the traces of this opening, not a doorway. I suspect, it's not labeled, but I suspect it's what we call a rob light. A window that allowed light from the street to come through the front room and illuminate this part of the staircase, which would have been very dark. I mean, remember, in 1853, it was much harder to light a space than it is today. This is that tiny office today. In the 1910 plans, it's listed as servant's sitting room, but that I'm sure was not its original purpose. But what you'll see here is a very simple molding along the top. Here is a chimney breast without the fireplace, without the mantelpiece that was removed who knows how long ago. And then looking back from Fifth Avenue to the rear wall, that rob light, if I'm correct, would have been right around here. But here you can really see, I have a close-up of this pilaster, part of the window frame here, and you can see, this is Greek Revival. By 1853, this style was definitely on the wane. But it implies something. The Hawleys were all right with this room being Greek Revival. Why? Until we find some letter explaining it, we don't know. But I just want you to compare the similarities with this run molding on the ceiling with this run molding at the Merchant's House down on East 4th Street. Now, many of you probably know the Merchant's House is the most intact pre-Civil War row house in the city of New York. And it's open as a historic house museum, so you can visit it and hopefully visit it often. So I just wanted to point that out to you. Small room, right off the service entrance, labeled servants' sitting room in 1910, and in Greek Revival style. The only thing that's missing from this room is the mantelpiece, which likely would have looked a lot more like this than the Italian marble mantelpieces you see elsewhere. Italian marble mantelpieces are almost always arched and do not have this kind of pilaster and tablature feel to them. So this is a very, very different look. Again, we don't know what was there, but it's very likely that that's what it was. This room was a multi-purpose room. It really depended on what family living in it wanted to use it as. Standard 4-bay floor plan. There's nothing exceptional about the floor plan in this house. These things were going up all over really wealthy neighborhoods for super wealthy people all over New York City, which was Manhattan in those days. So the floor plan's not extraordinary, not exceptional. The detailing is. What did the Hawleys use this room for? One possibility is this was Mrs. Hawley's office. Yes, is that for me? As the matriarch of the house, she would have been responsible for interviewing and disciplining servants. She would have been working with tradesmen and delivery people. She would have been responsible for the running of the house. Cook and she would meet and discuss the meals. And so it's very possible that this was her office. It could have been what they called a snuggery. That's a Washington Irving term, folks. He had a snuggery in his house up in Irvington and Sunnyside, and it was basically a kind of a den. It could have been a butler's office. Now, we know from the census reports, and we'll talk about those a little later, that the Hawleys did not have a butler, but later families did. So it's possible, especially as things became more formalized later in the century, that this became the butler's domain. As I said, it was labeled the servant's sitting room, but it's so near the family parlor, which we're going to talk about in a minute, that I find it unlikely that the servants would have been right across the hall from where the family was hanging out. Maybe it was a children's classroom. There were children, school-aged children here at the house, and these sort of families had governesses. It could have been an office for Mr. Park, or Mr. Chandler, or Mr. Kelly, and it could have also been a coachman's chamber. The coachman would not have been sleeping upstairs with the maids, folks. You find that too surprising. But we do know that both the Hawleys and the Parks had a coachman. And he would need to get out quickly in order to run to wherever the carriages and horses were being stored. This house did not come with a carriage house, so the occupants were leasing space somewhere nearby. And that's my vote. either Mrs. Office or the coachman's chamber. So let's walk across the hallway and look at what is now our dining room, and hopefully many of you will be in there tonight. But this room was really the most altered room in the entire building. Why is that? Well, for one thing, it was once 2 rooms with a divider in between them. If you look here in the 1910 plan, you can see, here's the part of the dining room you just saw in the photograph. Here's the rear part of the dining room, which was, I believe, originally the kitchen. We'll talk about that. And then in between was a dividing storage space, very similar to the ones that once existed on the primary bedroom floor, master bedroom floor. I didn't say that. Also on the floors above that. So, oh yeah, I forgot to say, turn off your phones. And anyway, so this is where we're going to visit right now. Here is the part of the dining room that now faces Fifth Avenue, and really the only thing that is intact are the 2 window frames. And even here, the windows originally came down to here, and I assume in 1917 they were raised because it really wasn't that appetizing staring into a kind of a pit. And so they raised the size of the windows themselves. If you examine them when you're downstairs enjoying dinner tonight, you will be able to detect immediately that these windows were reduced in size. So the window frames, what's left of the original windows, and the decorative security grills on the outside is all that is left of the original interior of this house. What did this room look like, conjecturally, in 1853? This was the room where the family spent a lot of time. This would have been the day room, it would have been the morning room, it would have been an informal room. At the merchant's house, they called it the family room or the family parlor. Using the merchant's house room as a stopping out point, here's my suggestion of what this room looked like in the 1850s. Ooh, exactly. Now, I don't know what the mantelpieces look like, or what the mantelpiece looked like in this floor, in this room, but it was very likely similar to this. This is one of the mantels up on the 3rd floor, and I just sort of fudged it in there. But this sort of very cozy, very informal, sort of den-like environment is much more what this room looked like than the formality of the rooms upstairs. The Hawleys didn't entertain all that much. They were kind of a quiet family, stayed unto themselves. So I suggest that they probably spent a lot more time in a room like this than some other families in the era who were much more into socializing and having parties and what have you. Did the family use the lower entrance underneath the stoop? Earlier, that would have been a yes. When the merchant's house was a new home in the 1830s, yes, the family would have been entering and exiting through the under entrance, the areaway entrance. By the 1850s, I'm not so sure. The family probably used it when it was convenient for them, but only if they would not be observed. And certainly later on in the century, no, absolutely not. Later in the century, they used the main entrance, the grand stoop and all that sort of thing. So let's take a look at that space in between. But you see the way it's divided up into spaces. And there's a big separation between the 2 rooms. One thing I did want you to notice, and those of you who come downstairs for dinner tonight, whatever you're in the dining room, is notice this funny arrangement. These are the original floor joists of the house. In 1853, they were covered by plaster. But this perpendicular piece here indicates that there was some sort of a wall configuration. I'm going to suggest that right here, matching up with that perpendicular, that cross beam, there may have been a small storage closet, it may have been a coat closet for the servants, something like that. And years later, it was eliminated. So this is the rear room, which I'm calling the original kitchen. And there's several reasons for this. In the 1910 plans, as I said, it was called the kitchen. The rear hearth is significantly larger than the one in front. I think that's important because a kitchen would need a large hearth. And here you can see the difference in size between the front room and the rear room. Plus the fact that there's some pantries indicated here, and there's a sink here in the corner. What could we have expected the kitchen to look like? Here's the hearth as I'm talking about it today. Very pretty, very useless. None of the chimneys are open, by the way. We can't burn fires in the house. I know because I've tried. 1853 probably would have looked a lot more like this. Now this is a sort of a turn-of-the-century kitchen. But by 1853, cooking technology, especially in a grand house like Fifth Avenue, would have implied a joint-use coal, wood, cast iron stove. It would have just been absolutely expected. And that would have filled the space here. And then that dividing area would have been a series of pantries. Now here we have a pantry example with 3 doors in it, and I remember my grandmother's pantry in her house in Brooklyn looked very similar to this. As far as we can tell, the one here only had 2 doors in it, but that could have been changed over the millennia as well. But that gives you an idea of what it looked like. So that sort of clues you into a very different reality for the dining room downstairs. Then here's the, why does that say laundry room? Well, this is the Wiggins bar today. But in 1853, in fact, it's labeled right here in the 1910 plan, laundry room unchanged. And where there's now a lovely fireplace with a wonderful bronze tablet over it commemorating the people who bought this house in 1917 and made it into Salmagundi with 1, 2, 3, 4 laundry tubs where the big banquette is next to the fireplace. So you see, here you go. This is indicated as closed in 1910, but that's probably because there was a serious water heater configuration there for all the laundry. And when this was the Dunsmore, I counted, and I could have missed a couple, 21 different living suites in the house. That's a lot of laundry. Now, it was a boarding house, so people stayed here for a certain amount of time, but you know the laundry was going up and down the dumbwaiter. Here's an example of zinc metal laundry tubs, which might have been what these were, or they could have been soapstone. There's examples of these in the merchant's house in their kitchen. Now, a laundry room, especially a laundry room as big as the Wiggins bar, ooh, that's what my grandmother used to say, you're really going to town now. A regular townhouse would not have been able to spare this kind of space. And they either did laundry in the kitchen or someplace very close to the kitchen, or they sent the laundry out, because there just was not room in your standard townhouse for affluent people. You know, when we're talking about working class, it's a whole different kettle of fish, folks. Now, here's what a laundry room of the era would have looked like. It's, you know, just a lovely recreation today, but there ain't no mistaking this for a bar. This is definitely a laundry room. And finally, I want to point something out in this illustration. Here is a cook stove, which would have been used in a laundry room to heat huge containers of water, or soapy water for special washing. This kitchen has a separate hot water heater built into the side of it. And these were very, very standard. The merchant's house had one itself, no longer existing. And if you go up again to Sunnyside, Washington Irving's home, you'll see that water heater. Something which nobody realizes, possibly with the exception of Richard Moses, is that in 1910, when they were converting the building to a boarding house, they constructed this smallish building in the backyard called the Servants' Building. Now that is the oh so elegant elevation of it. Now I've sort of enhanced what survives of the photocopy copies, but it was hardly architecturally distinguished, and it was also very small. This building is too small, and it's only 1 story tall, to have been quarters, to have been a domicile for the servants, unless there was an overnight servant who was on call there. So I'm a little bit at a loss of trying to figure out what this building was used for. It would make a great clubhouse. But I don't think that's what the servants were using it for. But it's fascinating. And then, of course, the traces of that are all gone now, because it was pretty much right here in the space, another floor down. What did backyards look like in the day? We have every reason to believe that the Hawley, and certainly the Park's backyard was decorated. The Parks put in that wonderful wall of windows right there, so they didn't want to be looking at laundry. Many houses in the era, not all, had rear piazzas, as they called them. I think we would call it a porch today, folks. But, and if they were enclosed, they were tea rooms. This is a photo of the Drummond family and staff in the late 19th century, and I mean staff. One of the wonderful things about this wonderful photograph is that here are 2 of the house servants, the house staff, coming out through the under entrance to the building. And it just emphasizes, first of all, the Drummonds loved their gardening. This house was built in 1833, originally for Edmund Forrest, by the way. And it still stands only in horribly mutilated condition today.
What house is that?
It's 436 West 22nd. And it was an outstanding 4-bay wide Greek Revival house. There's some wonderful photographs of it. I think I mentioned those in part 1. Also on YouTube. So anyway, this gives you an idea of how closely and yet how removed the servants and the family were themselves. The servants could be working underneath that porch, hanging up laundry when the family didn't want to see it, doing other tasks right off at the kitchen. And so it was a convenient place for them to work, especially if they had a lot of laundry and didn't want to carry heavy laundry up all those flights to the 4th floor or to the roof. Looking at this plan, so now just to give you an idea, 1910 servant sitting room, I think was Mrs. Hawley's office or possibly the coachman's chamber. The front room, the quote-unquote family room, the kitchen, laundry room. Look at the size of that laundry room. But this hallway offers no division between the two spaces. If we assume the Hawleys were using that front room in a traditional manner, the way they would have in a townhouse, they would have been down there most of every day. Breakfast, possibly informal meals during the course of the day, homework, reading the newspaper, lounging about, taking naps. It would have been the family room of its day. And here is the main staircase, which we descended, and here is the service staircase. And I want you to know this. There is no wall on the basement floor to that service staircase, unlike today where it's closed off. It was wide open in 1910. You would expect some sort of a wall here dividing the two domains of the floor at that level. And here is a bathroom, which I'm sure has been a bathroom ever since 1853, because the family needed a bathroom. What about those poor servants? I mean, they had body functions also. And I don't expect them to have the luxury that the Hawleys did, but it seemed like there needed to be a bathroom for the servants somewhere. And you can certainly bet money that they did not use the Hawleys' facilities. So here, in what is labeled as a serving room in 1910, because it's right by the dumbwaiter and right by the service staircase, which would bring it upstairs to the parlors, which in 1910 were the family room for the boarding house, I suspect there may have been a secondary, much more perfunctory bathroom for the servants themselves. If not on the 4th floor, then down on this floor. It just seems, logical today. I'm staring at this and saying, at least at some point in the 19th century, I think the family stopped using this as often, or maybe entirely. Interesting, very interesting. Richard's photocopies, hooray, hooray, show at some point in the 19th century, an opening had been cut through from the front room, the family room, to direct access to the service entrance underneath the stoop. That to me is a dead giveaway. I suspect very, very strongly that at some point in the 19th century, the family, in a house this large, abandoned use of the ground floor room. They had all those extra rooms upstairs. This is a big house. In a townhouse, it would have been a different story. In a 3-bay wide, or even a 2-bay wide house. But one of the things we do know is that when the Parks lived here, they sealed up the door between that big rear sitting room, mentioned in part 2, and the rear primary bedroom. And they used what could have passed as a sitting room earlier on as their family parlor. We know that because Darren Park talked about it being the family living room. He lived here until he was 11, and he came back and visited the house in the 1930s. So I'm going to propose that at some point in the 19th century, the servants took over this entire floor. It's pure hypothesis, but it's hypothesis based on my highly intelligent soul. So that brings us to another basement mystery. I can't tell you how many people have asked me if I'm going to talk about this space. So yeah, okay, I'm going to talk about this space. First of all, people keep asking me, are you going to talk about the gargoyles in the barn? And I bit my lip and said, well, there aren't any gargoyles in the barn. I want to thank Tom Miller of Daytonian in Manhattan. Those of you who don't know his blog should. 6 days a week, he explores the history of amazing buildings in an amazing borough. We were chatting the other day, and he said, well, I would call them telemans. And I said, that's really funny, because that's what I was thinking about calling them too. When I was at an event at some point, one of the wild parties we have, Michael Hopkins walked up to me and said, you're Anthony Bellov, aren't you? And I couldn't deny it because the people were already nodding. And he said, are you going to talk about the martini gargoyle? And I said, excuse me? What? Excuse me? And at that point, our own beloved Brandon Beckstrom, who works in the front office, many of you know him, said, oh yeah, those sculptures by Martini. And I'm like, what? We all knew that someone affiliated with St. Gaudens years ago had created these two telemans, but his name was completely forgotten. And records going this far back were destroyed in a flood. So we didn't know anything about it. If I'd been carrying something breakable in my hands at that point, it would be broken. I was so excited about this. So, who made our gargoyle telemans? By the way, that is, I call him Demon Cards, and I call him Demon Scotch. He's smoking a meerschaum pipe, and he's got clearly a wonderful hand of cards in his hands. And Demon Scotch is holding a whole bottle of scotch under one arm and a beer mug, so either Scotch Chaser or who needs the beer? Philip Martini, born in Strasbourg, May 19th, 1858. He died in Flushing, New York on June 26th, 1927. He was trained in the Paris atelier of Eugene Duc. He became foreman there, and after emigrating to New York in 1878, he found work with Augustus St. Gaudens. So that part of the myth was true. He remained there for 5 years and then worked for St. Gaudens frequently afterwards as an independent contractor. One of his buddies at St. Gaudens was Frederick McMonnies, another legendary New York sculptor, and he was a very good friend of Stanford White. Martini operated a commercial sculpture factory in New York City, which produced commissioned and mass-produced pieces in McDougal Alley. He frequently worked in staff, and staff is important because that's what the two telemans are made out of. They're made out of staff, which is an artificial stone used for covering and ornamenting temporary buildings, made of powdered gypsum, plaster of Paris, with little cement, glycerin, and dextrin, and mixed with water. It is easily cast in molds or sculpted. And Martini became especially adept at working in staff because he often worked with architects in Beaux-Arts architecture. When he first came here, architectural sculpture, apart from the fanciful decorations on buildings, was largely non-existent. But with the advent of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, the Beaux-Arts hit America like a cannon blast. And suddenly everybody was making Beaux-Arts buildings. And as you know, if you think of Grand Central Terminal, for instance, or the Public Library at 42nd Street, these buildings, the sculpture is part of the building, part of the architecture, not just ornamentation. So suddenly architectural sculpture became very, very important. And he definitely profited from it. He lived in Bayside, by the way, which is why he died in Flushing. Much of his surviving work is in New York, with additional bas-reliefs for the Art Institute of Chicago and government buildings in D.C. Martini was part of St. Gaudens' art colony in Cornish, in New Hampshire. He was part of the large team that sculpted the details for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. All those buildings were made of staff, so they could withstand the elements for a short while, but they were all temporary structures. And he even grabbed a couple of fragments of some of his sculpture and installed them up on the top floor of his studio in McDougal Alley afterwards, because he just couldn't bear with them. And this led to further commissions with the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901, and maybe in St. Louis, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in 1904. He also won a medal for his work at the 1895 Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta, Georgia. This man is important, and we have two of his works right downstairs. Tammany Hall gave him some plum projects, including completing the designs for the New York City Hall of Records over on Chambers Street, now the Surrogates Court. After architect John R. Thompson died in 1901, Daniel Chester French also worked with him on that project. Two projects that you can see of his in bronze are the two Doughboy statues, one in Chelsea Park and the other in Abingdon Square. So he worked in bronze as well as in marble. Yeah, you can just go and visit, see them anytime you want. He was married twice and had 8 children. His sons all worked with him in his workshop. And a debilitating stroke ended his career, and a second ended his life. His papers are all in the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian now. A few additional works: the William McKinley Memorial in Springfield, Massachusetts, Life Publishing Company Building, 19 West 31st Street. It's now the Herald Square Hotel. That wonderful gilded heraldic the sculpture of the winged angel, all gilded, Rococo cartouche of the main entrance, that's by him. He designed and laid out the north doors for St. Bart's, for St. Bart's, which were cast by Henri Monard. And just go to the Jefferson Building in the Library of Congress. The sculptural programs in bronze and marble on the 2 grand staircases are his. And of course, his masterpieces, the 2 Salmagundi Club. And I'm sorry, doesn't he look like Hugh Griffith? Hugh Griffith, for those of you who don't know him, in one of my favorite films, he's Audrey Hepburn's art forger father, how appropriate, in How to Steal a Million with Peter O'Toole. If you don't know the film, catch it, it's great. But, so this is Martini in 1904. This is Martini in 1917. I mean, really, is that a caricature of life? And then this is his long separated twin. Now, another thing about this archway, the club was so broke that the door on the men's room, right downstairs, all the men know it, it's right by the pool tables, broke. It fell off its hinges, and they couldn't fix it. They just could not find the funds to fix it. So when the club opened to women, by today's standards, a very tasteless inscription was painted in English letters. Yeah, I'm getting nods all over the room. I could not find anybody who recalls the actual wordage, and apparently there is a photograph of it in existence, which we have yet to locate. But it implied, how do I put this? Forgive me, this is 1973 talking now, not modern, not 2023. Women who cross this point shall be spanked.
All distaff.
I'm sorry?
All distaff.
All distaff?
Meaning?
Women are distaff.
That's what I believe.
Okay, here we go.
4 years.
Say it again, Michael, please.
All distaff shall be spanked.
All distaff.
I remember.
Anyway, that was up there for about 10 or 15 years until a film shoot occurred in the club and they complained about it. And Chris Nunnally, who many of you remember, who was recently deceased, who was working here for many years, grabbed a bucket of paint and just painted right over it. It's still there under several coats of paint, but maybe we don't need to resurrect that. Anyway, moving right along, we're going to hurry down the original service staircase to the cellar floor, because there's a myth down here. I was told that we have evidence of the Underground Railroad. If you go down into what I later learned was originally the coal and furnace room of the house, there is this heavy steel security door which opens into an arched tunnel. And there it is.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so Underground Railroad? Well, I'm sorry to tell you that if you notice right here, you'll see that the surface, the paving on the bottom of the tunnel rises at a very sharp slant. It's a ramp. In 1908, Fifth Avenue was widened. And all it takes is a little bit of measurement to realize that this ramp continued past this stone wall. It's Manhattan schist. An unfortunate name for dogs. But it's Manhattan schist, and this is infill. This ramp would have continued up and right to the curbside where a metal cap would have opened and coal would have been poured down the underground coal chute, but not the Underground Railroad. Although they might have had a little coal car down there on tracks, moving the coal deeper into the building, and it was not unusual in those days. For those of you who are interested, the coal chute now ends right here. This is the original, the old oil cap, which still protrudes. very briefly before we move on, here is the cellar floor. In 1917, when Salmagundi lowered the floor of the cellar, eliminating any evidence of what was there formerly, they subdivided these rooms into spaces and labeled them. They had an ice room, a wine cellar, a pantry, even men's and ladies' powder rooms, bathrooms. Now in 1910, these rooms are indicated as divided, but they don't specify what their uses were then. And just as an FYI, here is where the coal chute is located. And with that, I am going to rest my voice for a few minutes and turn the floor over to my dear friend and esteemed colleague, Anthony Haddad from the Merchant's House.
Thank you for warming up my audience. I'm delighted to be here with you this evening, really to talk about a subject that is very dear to my heart. The women and some men who I refer to as the unsung heroines and heroes of 19th century New York, because in their own way, these women had a profound impact on life in the 19th century and, in a sense, essentially changed New York City forever. And I hope that by the time I'm done with my 10 minutes, you will understand why I say that. I'm talking, of course, about the Irish domestic servant who lived and worked in homes like the Hawleys and the Treadwells at the Merchant's House, the very elite, wealthy people of New York. So here we have the 1870 federal census for this address, and you can see that there are 5 Hawleys living here at this time, but there are 6 domestic servants. 5 women and 1 man, and I'm going to read their names because I think it's important to do so. Margaret Collins, Sarah Callan, Catherine Core, Sarah Fitzpatrick, Anne Kelly, and the one gentleman, William Woodlock. I just love that name. And in a way, and you can see that they were all from Ireland. And in a way, these 6 individuals represented the millions of Irish people who immigrated to America in the 19th and early 20th century. The majority of those came in with one big wave from 1845 to 1852 that was known as, during what was known as the Great Hunger or the Great Irish Potato Famine. Typically, these people coming at this time were female, unmarried, Roman Catholic women with an average age of 21. They came with the goal of finding work and sending money back to Ireland so they could keep their families from starving to death and or to pay for their $20 passage to America. Now, I just want to make clear that the Irish had been coming for about 100 years before this, even before the famine, but that was a very different group. They were essentially relatively affluent, they were Protestant, and they were men, which made that group a lot more welcome than these people were. So let's start with their journey from the beginning. Once it was determined who was actually going to make the voyage to America, and once the $20 fee for passage was put together, they would generally have an American wake before the person left, because chances are that that person would never be returning. Only about 5 to 10% of the immigrants ever returned to Ireland. The crossing took about 6 to 8 weeks, and it was probably the most miserable 6 to 8 weeks that any of these people had ever endured. There was terrible hardship on these ships. There was very meager food, horrible unsanitary conditions, lots of sickness, and even death. So much so that during the height of the epidemic in 1847, these ships were called coffin ships. The Hawleys, 1870 servants in that group, would have come in through the Castle Garden Irish Immigrant Processing Center. Once they arrived, they would be making their way to the intelligence office, now known as an employment office, where house matriarchs like Mrs. Hawley or Mrs. Treadwell would have come in search of a new servant to replace the one that had departed. So the servants would be paraded in front of the wealthy woman, and she would hire someone on the spot and negotiate a salary and bring her home. Now imagine going from a dirt floor cottage like this one in Ireland to a row house like this. This is the merchant's house, an elegant, stately, very expensively made row house. So you can imagine how untrained for these positions these women were, and men. They were raw, is the term that was applied to them. So their learning curve was very, very steep. So with their little trunk, they would be shown to the back stairs. This is the back stairs of this house. Boy, I always say if those stairs could talk, what stories they would tell. I'm sure they will someday. And they would be brought up to their quarters. Now, this is the quarters at the Merchant's House Museum. You can see that it's very sparsely furnished, cast-off Treadwell furniture, metal beds to keep out the perceived vermin that came with these people, and bare floors. And here they would have typically shared a room with another servant. Now, let's go through, very quickly, a day in the life of a servant who was in the employ of the Treadwells or the Hawleys, for example. And I'm using images from the Merchant's House to make this clear to you. You will see that the day was extremely long, the work was hard, physical labor, never ending, and very often, just to point out, when there was a special event in the house, like a funeral, or a wedding, or childbirth, or sickness, anything that was outside of the ordinary day, their work was doubled and even tripled every time. So here we would start in the kitchen, because that is where the servants would come down at the crack of dawn, because they had to do so much work before the family was awake and needing their assistance. The cook would light the beehive oven, that's the little square on the left, which was lit with wood, and that is how she would bake the bread and all the other cakes and pastries that the family required. It took about 2 or 3 hours for that stove to heat up, just to give you an idea of how long everything took. And then she would, when the Treadwells first moved to the home, there was open hearth cooking, so she would have made a big wood fire in the hearth, but eventually the brand new cooking technology, as Anthony mentioned, the coal-burning stove. And the cook would be preparing all the meals all day long for the family. And it would be difficult for families like the Treadwells or the Hawleys. They were frequently having these big dinner parties, so the cook really had to up her game for those events. Imagine cleaning that stove. That was one of the bane of the servant's existence, having to clean that on a regular basis. Believe it or not, the cook and her assistant, the assistant, by the way, would probably be the most prettiest servant and the most, the neatest. And she would be the one who would wait on the family at table and wait on the family when there was company. And the cook's assistant would be in the family room setting the table for meals. Also, though, it's hard to believe that with all of that work, they still had to do the laundry, which was a 2-day affair in the big soapstone tubs, all day of soaking, washing, wringing, bluing, and drying the laundry outside in the big yard. On bad weather days, they would have to lug all of that wet laundry up to the top floor where there were clotheslines, and there they would hang the laundry to dry. Then on Tuesday was ironing day, and they would have to heat up many sad irons, as they were called, and they ran the risk of really getting burned and injured when they were operating, working with these heavy irons. Then the double parlors. These are the parlors of the Merchant's House. The parlor maid was responsible for maintaining these. These had to be guest ready 24/7, because this is the space that guests would see most frequently. So she would have to dust the parlors, sweep the rugs, polish all the silver, and she also answered the door, had to run errands, etc. And she would also be responsible for heating and lighting the house. Well, what's so difficult about that, right? Well, there are 7 fireplaces at the merchant's house, and she would have to go down to the cellar, fill the coal bucket, and as many times as it took her up and down the stairs, armed with coal, a bucket for ash, rags, brooms, water, to sweep out the fireplaces, sweep out the ash from the night before, replace everything, and stock the coal scuttles. And she would also have to light the house, so all of the lighting equipment that the Treadwells used, all of that essential portable lighting, as Anthony mentioned, candles and oil lamps, would have to be brought downstairs, cleaned and refurbished in whatever way was necessary. The chambermaid, her responsibility was to clean all the bedrooms. That meant airing out the linens, changing the linens if necessary, making the beds, which could take 1 hour and usually required 2 people to do that. Dusting, etc. And unfortunately, someone had to do it, emptying the commodes and chamber pots that the family had used the night before. These were, the contents were put into a big metal bucket with a lid, and that bucket would be brought out to the privy and the contents would be dumped right there. And then she would have to scald out and clean all of these chamber pots and replace them. And then before you know it, the call bells would ring, signifying that the family was awake and they needed their water for washing up. Now, at the merchant's house, each one of these bells has a different chime. And that would make it easy for a servant who might not be literate, who might not speak English, to understand and quickly learn where they were needed. Because if they didn't, chaos would ensue on a busy morning or a busy day if they were going off to the wrong rooms. So, that's briefly what the job was of the various servants. So why was it so appealing for women to take up this kind of difficult job? Well, what did they get in return? The average salary was about $5 a month. Laundresses and cooks could command a little bit of a higher wage. In return for that, they received a clean and hopefully safe room to sleep in. They received their meals. They may have received cast-off family clothing or gifts of clothing at Christmas time. And they may have even, depending on the benevolence of their employer, have received medical care if they became ill while they were employed. And it must have appealed to the women, to these Irish immigrants, because by 1860, over 75% of the Irish women who worked in New York were employed as domestic servants. But look at what they were up against. These are a sampling of advertisements for cooks, etc., maids, in the newspapers of the day. And every one of them says, no Irish need apply, or Protestants only. New York, in this period, was an extremely anti-Catholic city. There was the nativists were extremely active, thanks to the Know Nothings political group. There was tremendous hatred, tremendous prejudice against the Irish and against the Roman Catholics. And it was just so much mistrust and hostility. But these were people, wealthy people with lots of money, and they wanted servants. And the servants knew that they would never really be without a job. And here is what they would see in the papers of the day. But they quickly learned how to bargain for their value. They would quit at the drop of a hat in search of better positions with higher paying jobs, better food, better accommodations. There were no contracts, so they could leave at will. And this is what women like Mrs. Hawley and Mrs. Treadwell would talk about when they had their sociables. The servant problem. How do you keep these women from quitting so frequently? And of course, in the press, their assertiveness was portrayed as being ape-like, as being simian. It was really dehumanizing and disparaging and very offensive. And this is Thomas Nast, the man who created Santa Claus. So, did they succeed in their purpose? Well, you tell me. Over $260 million was sent home to Ireland in the course of the night. Yes, please. It was called the greatest transatlantic philanthropy of the 19th century. And they saved so much money that a bank had to open for them, the Immigrant Savings Bank. In 1850, because women wanted to be sure that their money would get home to Ireland for their family. And what this led to, they would send letters home, and these letters, in addition to, the women pouring out their emotions or telling about their day, it encouraged their family to come and join them and make that exodus. And this is how we have the beginnings of chain migration. And this is how New York City changed, because with that chain migration came millions of Irish who built the city. They built the infrastructure. And it profoundly changed the religious tenor of the city, because now we have Catholics, an increasing population of Catholics, and it also had a huge impact on the political life of New York City. But the major drawback to this job, I would say, for these women was, as one servant said, the awful lonesomeness. So many of them lived socially isolated. Imagine the tension that had to have existed in a household where you know that your Protestant employers really despise you as a group on some level and mistrust you. They did find comfort and relief through the Catholic Church, through the Irish Emigrant Aid Society that was founded in 1841, and other benevolent organizations that would give them a feeling of being home, or at least with their people. So I think it's important for you to realize, and for all of us to realize, that it would have been impossible. Yes, they did succeed in helping their families, but it would have been impossible for wealthy families like the Hawleys or the Treadwells to maintain the lavish, extravagant lifestyle that they did without the backbreaking labor of the Irish servants who worked for them. So that basically concludes my little talk. I encourage you, I've given you a taste of what it was like. If you want the whole meal, please come and visit us at the Merchants House Museum. We'd love to give you a tour. Thank you.
So important, and I suggest that maybe at some point in the future we can have a bigger bite right here, if you'll come back sometime. Well, that brings me up to the 4th floor. Where do these Irish servants live? Show of hands, how many of you, and I'm going to get through this quickly, how many of you have never been to the 4th floor? Okay, well you're going to go there now. This is actually one of my photographs that are on this exhibition right now in the library. For 2 more days, folks, so if you haven't seen my photos, please run up there before Sunday morning when we're taking them down. But that is in the library on the next floor out. That is the actual service staircase that the servants went up and down and up and down and up and down. We talked about the 1870 census. In 1900, the census represents 5 residents, once again, living here. They were the Park family at that point, and 7 servants. So they had increased the number of servants in the building. And one of the interesting things is that the Parks had a butler, which the Hawleys did not. But we're in the Gilded Age by 1900, folks. Here is a plan of the 4th floor in 1900. It surprisingly has not changed that much from 1853, but what I want you to focus on is right here. Yeah. Because you're going to see that, vanish. Now this is using today's floor plan, bless you. But 4 chambers across the front, 4 chambers across the back, what appears to be a functioning bathroom, and we'll talk about that in a moment, a sink out in the hall. Here's the service staircase. This big room, which is now the bathroom on that floor, was a linen closet in those days. And what's this big boxed-in area here, which is clearly not connected to the 4th floor? Anyone want to guess what that was? It's the skylight. Exactly. We can walk up to the 4th floor today in the skylight. In 1853, that was not the case. If you go up there, it feels like a rabbit warren. It's so easy to get lost up there. But in fact, it's not that complicated once you get the feel of it. Again, this is pre-1910. But this tan or orange, whatever color you want to call that. Yellow, not yellow, mustard, thank you. This mustard area is all public space. This more tannish area is the linen closet. Blue, water, I was being very creative there. And pink represents what could be bedrooms. We don't know they were all bedrooms, we don't know they were always used as bedrooms, but they're intended as rooms where one could sleep. This big area here was that workroom that Eddie referred to, where there would have been clotheslines and what have you. The one in the merchant's house still exists, although it's filled with collection objects now. But here, as you saw from the previous plan, there are 2 rooms now placed in here, which were illuminated by skylights when the Dunsmore created a boarding house. Totally illegal today, folks, but in 1910 it was okay. Now, quick views of where we are. You enter right through here, the star shows what we're looking at. This is now the big electronics IT, heavily ventilated computer area for the club. But you notice the level has been built up. I suspect, I have no way of proving it, without digging into the walls, that this was the original 1853 bathroom for the servants. So they had a bathroom on that floor.
Okay.
What would they have done otherwise? Chamber pots carried them all the way downstairs. Was there a latrine in the backyard? A privy? We don't know, because the backyard is, we're in it right now. So the entire ground level has been lowered, so we don't know. But by 1853, I think it's safe to assume the servants had at least one bathroom somewhere in the building. What is now the bathroom, you see this door frame right here, that's the door to what was a linen closet in 1853. Here's the plan in 1917 when the clubhouseification began, and at that point they put showers into the linen closet and 2 toilets here in the former bathroom. They removed this tub, which shows in dotted lines. And, the sink was moved to 2 sinks here by the showers. And today, those 2 showers are what we call the Norman Rockwell Memorial Bathroom. We don't know that Norman actually ever used this bathroom, but it's very likely he did, because for many, many years, these servants' rooms upstairs were also club members' bedrooms when they were staying in town for short periods of time. So we moved into this big bedroom. It's a nice space. I mean, it really is a very nice space. There it is in 1910, here it is today, and there's this strange little room off to the back here that opens onto an air shaft that runs through the building, and there are windows in the bathrooms all the way down the building opening to this air shaft. Looks like it wanted to be a bathroom, but I have found no indication that it ever was. A much less grand bedroom is right next to it. These rooms were doled down as status symbols, of course. The butler got the best room on the floor. The scullery maid got the least grand room. And this is probably the dingiest, most depressing of all the rooms in the house. And it also faces east, so whoever was in here would be expected to get up early in the morning. So let's put 2 and 2 together. This is a photo of the servants' room in the Emily Dickinson House Museum. This gives you an idea of what this room very likely looked like. Notice there, by the way, there's a pot here. And here's a tub. I'm not justifying this existence, but many of people who were newly arrived in America and living in an environment like this would have thought, really, that they were living in a palace. Wooden floors, walls, windows with glass in them. So it's all relative. They worked very, very hard, and I think Annie made that point brilliantly. But it really becomes all relative. What I'm showing you now are some of the spaces that the servants actually experienced. Here are those 2 skylight rooms. Again, as I said, they were added in 1910 as boarding house rooms, and there was a skylight in each of the rooms, completely against building codes today. There's the star showing it open before 1910. But if you walk down this hallway, you come to this corner, and here the arrow indicates it. There's even a little touch of architecture on the servants' floor. This is a corner turned corner to prevent a sharp-edged corner from being chipped when work is being conducted here. There would have been all sorts of work going on. And so this little rounded corner actually protects the corner from being chipped. But the Hawleys included a little lamb's tongue detail at the top. So even way up on the 4th floor, there is still some period architecture. Okay, We're coming to the end, folks, but I just had to mention this person, courtesy of Bob Mueller. The missing governess, Mademoiselle Eve Josephine Schmechani. I've been practicing that name all day. Hungarian governess who worked for the parks for many, many years. She helped raise their children. And unfortunately, one of the passport photos we could not find. We don't know what she looked like. But she's mentioned in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. The parks were from Pittsburgh. March 30th, 1900. The Fricks and the Parks are traveling together in Atlantic City, staying at the Hotel Traymore, along with the governess and the two children of the Parks, one of them being Dara. In 1900, I calculate Schmechani as being roughly 69 years old. Dara was 8 at this point. So she remained in their service a while longer. But in 1909, she had already retired. There was a huge search for her. And this is the other side of the coin with servants. And it's worth talking about. She was so beloved that William Park left her $15,000 in his will. And when he died in 1909, I calculate she was about 78 years old at that point. And they couldn't find her. The reason they couldn't find her is because they spelled her name wrong. And it took about 2 weeks to locate her. But in his will, he wrote her enough money to enable her to return to her native land and live in comfort the remainder of her days. $15,000, by the way, today is roughly equivalent of $500,000. So it took about 2 weeks to find her, but the will was probated. She received the $15,000 and she vanishes from history at that point. But here is a servant that was so esteemed and honored by the family that they gave her a huge amount of money. Where did she sleep? In the original plan, there are 2 interesting suites of rooms. You see them bigger here, facing Fifth Avenue. Now this is again just my Sherlock sleuth hat, but this suite of rooms, with the door opening between them, there's the door right there between the 2 rooms. So this room full of paintings is this room here, and this room full of paintings is that room there. But there's a complex series of closets here. This is a double closet, which shows on the plan right here. Now, who had more stuff? The butler or the governess who worked with the family for like 30 years? I'm guessing the governess did, especially if she was traveling around with the kids and going to places like Atlantic City. But these are all snaps of what that suite looked like. Nice, biggish window facing the church across the street. This view has not changed since 1853, nor has the window. This heating unit, don't look at that. That wasn't there. A marble mantelpiece with a beautiful cast iron surround inside it. All these rooms were heated by coal. Heating was never installed up there. We wish the chimney still worked on a really cold day. It could be pretty cold up there. But my theory is that this was the butler's suite here, and this was Mademoiselle Schmechani's suite here. Her name was so hard to say, they always called her Mademoiselle, understandably. A couple of quick last looks at the 4th floor. I just wanted you to get an idea of what's up there. Lots and lots and lots of paintings. On the back windows, the shutters would have been outside, not inside the way these are interior shutters. Here is another connecting doorway between 2 rooms. My guess is this is the butler suite. Again, it's just a guess. Here is that marble. This is local marble, not Italian marble, with a beautiful cast iron inset in it. I mean, it was pretty. You know, so they did have something decent to look at. Here are the original boarding house numbers for the rooms. This is room 2, that's room 6 from 1910. The windows on this floor were all pegged construction. Can you see the wooden pegs and the joints of the uprights and the cross pieces and the sashes? Exactly the way the merchant's house was built in 1832. Michael Devonshire, who's here tonight, my hero, formerly of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Hooray, Michael. Thank you for all of your service for sane people. Likes to call the windows at the merchant's house the Duncan Fife of windows because they are so well made. These windows have not been particularly cared for, and they're still in great shape and working since 1853. And here, a last shot showing you one of the windows in the curved extension of the house. The glass in those windows is curved. So, let's go back down for one last quick look at something that the servant would have really emphasized the difference between the servants and the family. Here's the wooden staircase. When you land on the 3rd floor, you now see a metal staircase climbing up to the 4th floor. You also see very open space with ornamentation here. This is all original. This is mostly secondary ornamentation because of the 3rd floor, so it wouldn't have the same grandness as the parlor floor. But one thing you can't help but miss is this enormous soaring steel staircase, which was installed by order of the city in 1956 to create a second egress from the 4th floor. And happily, it did, because even though it required cutting the beautiful domed skylight in this building in half, it spared us from having to remove the entire grand staircase. So it's the lesser of two evils. Here, there's a railing which originally would have continued across because there would have been no staircase. This would have just been an open space that you could just lean over and look straight down for several stories. And the dome takes up a major chunk of the 4th floor, but servants were not privileged to access that dome. And this is what the dome would have looked like in 1853. This is my own recreation of it. It originally had an amber-colored skylight in it, and this is very likely something we will never see again, but enjoy it right here and now. I apologize for that, but I just have some closing words. First of all, I need to thank a woman who would not take no for an answer. These talks were made under coercion and prompting from Carol Teller. Basically said she would let me become a member unless I talked about this. And as you heard me mention before, there are so many other people to thank, including the Salmagundi Club, Nick and the crew and the staff and the board, and they were so patient, so helpful, and so supportive of these talks. And I just, everybody else is here. Thank you to Village Preservation. Thank you to the Merchants House Museum for co-sponsoring these. And I just need to say that part of the purpose for these talks was to increase awareness of what's here. People don't realize what's in this building. And as time progresses, little by little, more and more is being lost. A hole is drilled here, something is replaced there. We've got a treasure in this building. This is the oldest mansion standing on Fifth Avenue, period. And we need to love it, we need to take good care of it. And I hope these talks have encouraged you all to appreciate it a little bit more. I want to thank you so much.